Hello, and welcome back to another brand new episode of The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library cards, my darlings. I'm just saying that on autopilot now, aren't I? I need to start changing it up a bit. But I don't know how right now. I just open my mouth and things come out. Story of my life, that. Anyway, it's been a hot minute since we had a little bathroom blog. So I thought, you know, in my role of, or rather my raison d'etre of being consistently inconsistent, I bring you back to my gracious bathroom, and film from here. So here we are again, happy as can be. It is yet another edition of The Library is Open that is taking place in non-fiction November, which, if you haven't caught up yet, is what I'm doing all month, trying to read non-fiction fairly exclusively, with some slight variations. Like, I don't mind cheating on non-fiction occasionally, but I'm not blogging, or vlogging I should say, about anything non-fiction at the moment, just because you know, I'm really enjoying the way that it's allowing me to explore non-fiction texts more, which, as you know, it's not my go-to, and you know, this is as good an opportunity as any. So I've essentially manufactured a reason, but I feel like that's fine. So I'm just holding myself to account there. And, you know, it has been good. I've tried to read across a variety of, you know, styles within non-fiction, genres, different areas, from autobiography to essay to, you know, straight up, you know, things based on subjects. Although I have noticed that a lot of the non-fiction that I've been reading still have story-like elements in them. But you know what? Let's just go with it. That's what it's been. So, but it does say a lot about me, I think, and my reading tastes. So anyway, and this episode's book is no exception. So today I want to talk a little bit about this one, which was really hyped on, and rightly so, on Booktube, and you know, a lot of people were discussing it in the videos, and so I picked it up after work one day, and just thinking, you know what, I'm going to give that a go, and I'll tell you for why in a sec. But let me introduce you to the book. So this is Pandora's Jar. I nearly said Pandora's Box then, which is, I'll come to that, by Natalie Haynes, who is a classicist and a sort of broadcaster and journalist, I believe. Writer and broadcaster, sorry. She writes for, like, I think The Guardian and The Independent, so the slightly better papers. And, you know, as I say, her specialist subject is classics. I think she has a show as well called Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics, which I do want to check out after having read this. But the subtitle to this is Women in the Greek Myths. Now, working in the theatre and also in teaching the theatre, you know, there is this, I think, assumption that or rather people, know an awful lot about Greek mythology, you know, because we have this idea that the sort of modern traditions of theatre and performance started in Greece, which I actually dispute. I think they're much older than that, but that's not for here. But actually, that's not the case. I know a lot of actors and, you know, acting teachers and so on and so forth, and also people that are writers and in a writing, or from a writing background, are very au fait with classical storytelling, but that's never me. It's never really hooked me, other than doing sort of Greek stuff at school. So sort of Greek life and Greek mythology, the gods and so on and so forth. I haven't really ever read around it much. It's never really appealed in the same way that other things have. I'm much more likely to go to, like, folktale from various countries than I would be to go to Greek myth, and I don't really know why. I do remember making a Dionysus puppet that was brilliant when I was at school, but and I suppose that makes sense, doesn't it? Dionysus, the god of wine and song, so essentially the theatre, basically. And obviously, back in ancient Greece, when they would have the theatre festivals, when, like, the major playwrights would write new entertainments, it was for, like, the festival of Dionysus. So I suppose that sort of makes sense why I would gravitate towards him. I think I ended up making him look like a sort of blonde David Jason, which wasn't intentional, but there we go. So yeah, in this book, what Natalie Haynes sets out to do is sort of redress the canon, basically, of these incredibly famous Greek myth stories that exist in our culture, even outside of their original origins. So, you know, we all think we know the story of Pandora's box, for instance, or Oedipus, or Helen of Troy, or the Medusa myth, you know, things like this. And because actually they've transcended their origins and they've been seen in like loads of popular culture over the generations, so that now it almost feels like they're sort of world stories in a way, but they absolutely came from somewhere. So what she does is she sort of selects, let me just count how many it is. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 different female characters from Greek myth, and looks at the stories as they've been presented, and then looks at loads of different other sources as well, because oftentimes, you know, the Greek myths would be rewritten, and or stories, I should say, not always necessarily myths, I suppose, we'll never know, rewritten and reinterpreted by people who've put very different spins on them, and it's about which story is allowed to prevail. And what you often find is that, as with, you know, a lot of storytelling, the female characters are in the background, but actually Natalie Haynes is sort of saying, whoa, hold on a minute. Actually, the female characters are the axle on which a lot of the stories turn. And is there a reason that they've been portrayed in a certain way that is both due to, you know, misogyny, but also misunderstanding and minimalisation of their roles? So, for instance, you know how sort of, sorry, I'll just unpack that a little bit more. So you know how sort of like when stories get passed on and then details get changed, and then over time that just becomes the accepted story. So I think that's a lot what she's talking about here, and she's sort of putting these female characters back centre stage, and looking at you know, a variety of sources to sort of say, well, what about this, what about this, what about this, and why wouldn't we want as broad an overview of who these characters might have been and why as we possibly could, you know. The only opinion is an informed opinion. So yeah, she sort of starts off with the title of the book. We think about Pandora, who, you know, was is alleged to have had this box full of sorrows that she opened. Well, the idea is basically it's similar to like the Adam and Eve creation myth, in terms of that Pandora was told she couldn't open the box, and then she did because she couldn't not, you know, because she was too curious, and then released all the ills into the world because the world was perfect before, or something, which is similar to, you know, Eve eating from the apple on the tree, which was really interesting because if you remember, I read Philip Pullman's On Stories and Storytelling a few weeks ago, and a few episodes ago, I should say, and he talks a lot about you know, the demonization of Eve in that, but the flip side of the idea that actually in like Gnostic beliefs, the eating of the apple was a good thing, and actually the snake in the Garden of Eden was a hero because it gave Eve the power to access wisdom, and that we shouldn't mourn the loss of innocence, we should welcome a new era of wisdom. So that's really interesting. I do find it fascinating because I teach creation myths in one of my classes, and the thing that always blows my mind, and I may have mentioned this before, but it continues to mind blow, is that, you know, no matter what culture you look at in the world, or, you know, what civilization from however far back, we all have the same, slight variations, but we all have the same creation stories. You know, the details may be different, and, you know, the names will be different, and the precise circumstances, but they're all the same. They have so many things in common, and I just find it mad that long ago, that, you know, in a time when we weren't able to freely communicate with the other side of the world, or maybe even knew that other sides of the world existed, that we could somehow almost spontaneously come up with the same stories, which I think speaks to a need that we have from those stories that also crosses over into faith and religion. There's something fundamentally human that we require to be explained to us, or required to attribute things to, phenomena or circumstance. and I think that's how it happened. So the details got mixed up along the way, but the same basic need is being met by that story. But I digress. So yeah, starting off with Pandora, she then goes back to look at various artworks and various retellings of the story and various, sources of where Pandora came from and so on and so forth. And the reason it's called Pandora's Jar is the fact that actually there's no real record in the texts from that time of her actually having a box. So that's something that developed along the way somewhere. It was actually a jar, apparently, and apparently Pandora was created by Zeus, so the king of the gods, or the ruler of Mount Olympus, they're as a form of revenge. I don't want to spoil the stories too much. As a form of revenge against mortals. So, but what's interesting is that she then says, so why then, assuming that that's true, that essentially Pandora is godly, why then is, in her story, has she been judged as a mortal and, caveat to that, a female mortal, who is then blamed for all the sorrows in the world, when actually what she did was entirely orchestrated by the gods, the male gods, for a misdemeanor by a male mortal, or maybe a titan, I forget, but that sort of sets her stall out of where this is going, and she does it so beautifully. She does it really tongue-in-cheek as well, because much like Philip Pullman that I talked about in a previous video, she takes it very seriously, as well she should, and applies an academic approach, but it's not an academic text. So like her sources may be like, Renaissance paintings or ancient scriptures, but they're also episodes of Star Trek, or iconography from like Beyonce and things like that, because the pan out from these ancient stories is immense, and we continue to feel the ripples. Definitely mixed a metaphor there, but you get the idea. So she doesn't shy away from going, what he's essentially saying, and I believe this too, that it's like, why is an episode of The Simpsons not equally as valid as, the Book of Revelation or whatever? They're both cultural sources in one form or another, and there isn't, again, a hierarchy of what is allowed to matter more, I don't think. I don't think people agree with that as a general rule, but I think she does that really, really well. So yeah, she goes through a lot of things whereby there's quite a few stories as well where I was like, oh, that's who that is. Like I've heard the names, or I know the stories, usually the male stories, and I didn't know the female protagonists who were actually instrumental in the stories. I suppose a little bit like Shakespeare, really, in terms of, the minimisation of the female characters. We were having a discussion at work the other day about Hamlet, for example, and the lack of lines for the female characters. So you look at like Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, and also Ophelia, Hamlet's would-be girlfriend, that has that humongous plot line where she is driven to insanity, debatably, and they're barely in the damn thing. And I wonder if that's I suppose the thing is that like when these things were being performed as well, men would be acting all the parts, so maybe people didn't notice as much that we're creating these works, because they would still see a male body even if it was a female character. But it is a lot, I think, about what agency women were allowed to have in these times, what power, and if they did have power, how that could be combated by demonising them. She sums that up really well with the stories of like Jocasta, who is, part of the Oedipus myth, whereby she is Oedipus's mother, but she also marries him not knowing that he's her son. And, there was that whole prophecy about like, which Freud co-opted as like the Oedipus complex, of the man who will kill his father and marry his mother. But actually, Natalie Haynes makes a great case whereby Jocasta, the mother and wife in question, sounds a bit hillbilly, that, doesn't it? oops, don't demonetize me, and don't send me hate mail, but she actually figures things out a lot quicker, even though she hasn't done it intentionally. She realises things much quicker than Oedipus does, but yet she's not really allowed to claim that part of the story. You know, it's how we think about what we're told and how we interpret that in terms of what our like framework is. Similarly with Medusa, I know I love Medusa. I'm a big fan of Medusa, like the iconography of the snakes and so on and so forth. And Natalie Haynes really cleverly in this, I don't know why I keep saying her name, Natalie, really cleverly, keep saying her full name, I mean, really cleverly unpicks like the stuff behind the creation of Medusa as a character, and also the idea around like the Gorgon, which Medusa was a Gorgon and could turn people to stone. But like there were details that I never knew. So my sort of relationship with that story was purely through who is it? Is it Theseus? No, it wasn't Theseus. Was it? Who fights Medusa? I have read this. It's Perseus, wasn't it? Perseus. And yeah, so Perseus, and the way that actually Medusa is, and we only get that little part of her story, but actually, you know, in the way back, she was appallingly mistreated. She apparently had sisters. She may well have been either human or god, depending on which source you listen to. She may well have been sexually assaulted, which is worryingly commonplace in these ancient Greek stories. There is a really dodgy bit in the chapter actually on Helen of Troy, where they talk about some of the stories of like her being taken away by her would-be husband, and you're like, yeah, she was 7. And the next time the scene picks up, she's had a baby. I mean, even by ancient world standards, it's a bit like, come on, that's creepy. Well, it's more than creepy. It's, you know, to judge by today's standards, it's revolting, it's disgusting. But, you know, even by those standards, which were not our own, I think we still have to sort of acknowledge that that's not okay. So, yeah, they talk. She talks a lot with Medusa about, you know, the symbolism of, you know, the removal of Medusa's head, but her power to still turn people to stone, the way that, you know, the heroes who fight against her and people similar to her in Greek myth are, when you unpick what they actually do versus the power that she actually has, how they're actually really lucky that they won. It's not to do with their skill or bravery or anything, because actually she should clearly have been able to overpower them. And, you know, these were circumstantial victories as they were. So why is that the story that, you know, persists? I think I won't talk about them all, but my favourite chapters are on Eurydice. So obviously, famously, Orpheus and Eurydice, who, you know, Eurydice dies and Orpheus goes to the underworld to beg for her to be brought back to life. And for some reason, it's like, that's okay, but only if you lead her out of the underworld and don't look back. And when he does look back, he loses her forever, basically. And she sort of goes over like various incarnations of this myth, and she proposes the idea that maybe Eurydice was just fed up of Orpheus. It makes sense in the context of how she's talking, and that actually, if we give Eurydice her agency back, that puts a whole different spin on the story, whereby maybe she wanted to remain in the underworld because at least she was at peace, and that actually it was a welcome escape for her. And it really just does go to show, doesn't it, that even in a book or a non-filmed media thing, where you put the camera really matters. And who is your protagonist? Whose eyes do we see the story through? Who are we supposed to sympathise with? So that's really fascinating. But my absolute favourite chapter is the one on Medea. So obviously, this is my one theory thing that I do love in Greek, from Greek tradition. The story of Medea, which is a wonderful character.
obviously married to Trajan, who is essentially cheating on her and taking a second wife, and she plots his downfall, essentially, and also, which is the big takeaway from this, the killing of her own children to avoid being shamed and to smite her enemies, essentially. But what makes Medea such a fascinating character is the depth of emotion, particularly in the plays. Obviously, there's loads of translations, but as a character, she's so psychologically complex, and she switches on like on like the spin of a coin, but not in like an indecisive way. More in terms of like how she is able to, you know, in what is what was quite a ritualistic and in some ways now simplistic form of drama. How she's able to show all the different facets of her personality. She's so, you know, one minute she's steadfast about killing her children, and she has justifications, that's the thing. The other is about, she's like, no, I couldn't possibly do this, so on and so forth. The next, she's scheming, she's much cleverer than any of the male characters. That shouldn't be a surprise, but it is in this, you know. And actually, you know, Euripides, Natalie Haynes credits with being really, who's the playwright who wrote most prominently about Medea, wrote wonderfully for women, or female characters, I should say, making them as psychologically complex, but also as powerful, if not more so, than the male characters or their male counterparts. And yet, what is the pervading story is that Medea is seen as the worst mother in history because she killed her own children. But actually, when we unpack it a little bit, there's so much more to the story. And once again, I think that really ties into, you know, leading us to think about who gets to tell the story and what is their motive. You know, when we think about these stories as being palatable for Greek society, Greek male society, who is allowed to have power, who is allowed to have agency, who is allowed to prevail, and what's the takeaway lesson that will be most popular with the audience. So yeah, I won't discuss any further on this because I really do absolutely recommend this, even if you don't have a particular interest in Greek or more general like mythologies and stuff like that. It's just a fascinating read. It's really easy to read without being overly simplistic, so, and it doesn't assume that you have any more knowledge than you do have, which I love about that, because it's never patronising nor assumptive, which is a really hard balance to strike. I'll definitely be looking at Natalie Haynes' other stuff. She's written fiction as well, I believe. It's The Children of Jocasta, 1,000 Ships, and I will definitely be checking her show out. Natalie Haynes stands up for the classics, because I think, you know, if we're going to revere ancient storytelling and still keep talking about it, then we better blinking interrogate it as well, and not make it precious. The same as we do with Shakespeare. Let's not be precious about things. Nothing is untouchable. And it can always be reimagined, reinterpreted, rediscovered, rediscussed, and sometimes discarded as nonsense. You know, just because classic's a weird word. Sometimes things aren't classic, they're just old. And that's the tea on that. So thank you for joining me for another bathroom edition of The Library is Open, and the fourth instalment of #Nonfiction November. Hope you've enjoyed. Do put those library cards somewhere safe now, won't you? And avoid splashback. It's a bath reference. Once again, or just quickly mention, I am wearing my Vegan Queens sweatshirt because our Vegan Queens merch line is now available via Teespring. The link will be in the description again. If you are looking for Christmas presents, or if you want to support the Vegan Queens, or you just fancy some new togs or a new phone case or bag or whatever, pay us a visit and grab yourself a bargain. Ooh. But thank you so much, my darlings. Hope you're staying safe, hope you're staying well, hope you're staying warm. It's bloody freezing, isn't it? In the words of Keris from Catatonia. But until the next time, take care, and I will see you very soon. Mwah.